So we've got a little World War I propaganda here. Sow the seeds of victory, plant and raise your own vegetables. Write to the National War Garden Commission, Washington, D.C. So what do we call these when you grow your own food during wartime? Anybody ever heard of a victory garden before? People were encouraged to grow victory gardens. So we got people that are young and old to participate. Do keep in mind that the Wilson administration, they've got their own domestic policies, like as Hunter brought up, running on the campaign of New Freedom, establishing the Federal Reserve, other progressive plans like Clayton Antitrust Act, Children's Bureau, etc. But Wilson also continues this era of imperialism as well. He does bring into some of the dollar diplomacy. Going to move toward the passage of the Jones Act that gave us territorial status in the Philippines. Persuaded Congress to repeal the Canal Tolls Acts. He goes on to follow through with the Roosevelt corollary, breaking up disorder in Haiti by sending Marines into Haiti and the Dominican during his time in office, and making the purchase of the Virgin Islands from Denmark to become the U.S. Virgin Islands. So here we have Woodrow Wilson, Virginia native, born in Stanton, Virginia, goes on to become PhD from Princeton, president of Princeton, and later governor of New Jersey. Let's talk a little bit about diplomacy in Mexico. Mexico is in a three-pronged war. Some would call it civil. Others would consider it more of a bit of a regional conflict in Mexico during this era. It's pitted between three leaders that are vying for control of Mexico: General Huerta, Carranza, and Francisco Pancho Villa. The United States and Wilson backed reluctantly the Huerta regime, which pitted the Carranza and Pancho Villa regimes, or at least Pancho Villa's band of soldiers, against the United States. This all reached a head on the border of the United States and Mexico when some American civilians were killed in the city of Columbus, New Mexico by Pancho Villa. Carranza also launched attacks against American civilians. Wilson and the United States decide to raise an expeditionary force led by General John J. Pershing, and they're going to march on Mexico to battle Carranza and Pancho Villa. They will clash with some of these soldiers and bandits. Pancho Villa was much more difficult to pin down. In fact, Pershing was unable to capture Pancho Villa, and it's not until later that Pancho Villa is going to be not taken out by the United States, but Pancho Villa was taken out by his own men. So on the top left, we have Blackjack Pershing. On the right, Pancho Villa. On the left, political cartoon of Uncle Sam chasing down Pancho Villa during the era. The reason I bring up the Mexican intervention is because it's going to have some implications on pulling us into the war. All right, so there are a number of different causes of World War I. The rise of nation states, the buildup, militarism, larger standing armies, larger navies. You also have competition for colonial land holdings in Africa, India, Pacific, China. And ultimately, this leads to a number of entangling alliances. For example, Austria-Hungary wants control of Serbia. Russia, still under the control of the Tsar, wants to back Serbian nationalism. Germany wants to back Austro-Hungarian imperialism. So in a parade in the summer of 1914, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie were in the city of Sarajevo. A group of Serbian nationalists, known as the Black Hand, were plotting this man's assassination. The assassination attempt, led by Gavrilo Princip, went disastrously wrong. They missed their opportunity. But the motorcade turned down a wrong street directly back to the assassin, where the assassin was able to shoot and kill the target. This is the domino that sort of cataclysm that leads to the events of World War I. What I want to highlight here is the assassination of this one man and his wife were just a tipping point. All of the other things like diamond mines, oil reserves, alliances that were connected to intermarriage and related monarchs, all that was just a culmination of causes prior to this event being the final event that pushes the world into war. So, Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia, Russia backs Serbia, Germany backs Austria-Hungary, Britain will back Russia, France will back Russia, and so began the forces that become known as the Triple Entente, the Allied powers, or what will become known as the Allies, and the Central Powers that were led by Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and Turkey. Here we have on the left Archduke Franz Ferdinand, on the top right Gavrilo Princip, and on the bottom right, bless you, we have the assassination. If we take a look at the map, this is a very simple legend to help you out. Triple Entente, Central Powers, neutral. Triple Entente, England, France, Russia. Other countries will join the Triple Entente. The United States will come on at the side of the Triple Entente. Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, Turkey. So I'll get to your question in just a second. I've got a couple of primary docs I want to pass around related to this. The first is a newspaper from a copy of the New York Times. It's got the assassination of the Archduke and his wife. Let's go pass that around. And then I think this is a really awesome propaganda poster. This is a Russian propaganda poster early on in World War I. The motherland defeating the two-headed monster that was Germany and Austria-Hungary. Pretty cool. Yeah, Ian, what's up, buddy?
I was going to ask, was like Italy initially part of the Central Powers? They were aligned to Germany and Austria-Hungary.
Yeah, and then wind up there. And then it's a little ironic because, well, I don't want to get too far into myself, but so they end up fighting on that side, but then when the war's over, they really weren't hit as bad as other places during the Great Depression. So it's kind of wild that they had a decent amount of stability at the end of the war, but there was one big issue. They felt that they had been
Cheated while they were winning, right?
correct.
What happened,
Exactly. Very good. Good job, Ian. Let's talk a little bit about the German U-boats. The underwater boats or undersea boats, the German U-boats, they're cruising all over the Atlantic, taking out British ships, but they not only take out some British ships, but they also take out, or are going to launch attacks on some American ships. So some of the ships that are involved, we have the Lusitania, which is a British passenger liner. This would be like, sort of like the Titanic getting sunk by British submarines. Over 1,000 people will die, 128 of which were Americans. But listen up, if you were to get on the Lusitania on May 7th, 1915, you would have received this notice. Notice, travelers intending to embark on the Atlantic voyage are reminded that a state of war exists between Germany and her allies and Great Britain and her allies, that the zone of war includes the waters adjacent to the British Isles. That in accordance with formal notice given by the Imperial German government, vessels flying the flag of Great Britain or any of her allies are liable to destruction in those waters, and that travelers sailing in the war zone on ships of Great Britain or her allies do so at their own risk. Imperial German Embassy, Washington, D.C., April 22nd, 1950. So check that out. You would have received that if you're stepping on board the Lusitania. Lusitania did in fact have munitions aboard, and it wasn't just the Lusitania. The Arabic was sunk in August of 1915. The Sussex was attacked. So these are important naval conflicts. Do keep in mind, Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan resigned his position on the cabinet as opposed to going to war. Here we have a German U-boat from the air. I've passed around the scuttled primary document of a scuttled German U-boat. This is the Lusitania. Pretty big ship. So what pushes America to war? A number of issues. Number one, German spy rings being intercepted. Number two, this right here, the Zimmerman note. Now you might have different conspiracy theories as to whether this did or did not exist, but this note sent by Arthur Zimmerman to Mexico, promising that if Mexico invaded the United States, Germany would militarily back them, politically back them, and help them regain control of lands lost in the Mexican War. Basically, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Nevada, California. So that's the Zimmerman note. There's also a really important factor that kind of gets left out of this story, and it is money. We have a serious trade relationship with England, and our trade with England far exceeds that of Germany. So we almost have to make a decision. If we're going to be a non-belligerent and want our cake and eat it too and trade with everybody, that's probably not going to work. So what are we going to ultimately do? Well, we're going to go with our largest trade partner. Another issue that's really important that I also believe gets left out of the story, because when you think World War I, you're always thinking Lusitania and Zimmerman note. Another thing we should remember is the Bolshevik Revolution. Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, those guys rise to power. Tsar Nicholas is overthrown. Russia essentially pulls itself out of the war, and now they've led a communist revolution, and they are knocking on the doorstep of Western Europe. And that is a threat, because we don't want to see communism spread. So when we declare war on, Wilson asked for a war declaration on April 2nd, 1917. The declaration comes on April 6th. And Wilson, in his address to Congress and to the world, the United States, the U.S. must make the world safe for democracy. That becomes sort of the famous quote used by Wilson. Keep in mind, Wilson has a plan. That plan is known as the 14 points. I'm not too concerned with you knowing every single portion of the 14 points, but I want you to know the highlights. So on January 8th, 1917, Wilson delivered the 14 points address to Congress. Here are some of the idealistic goals for peace: no more secret treaties with foreign nations, freedom of the open seas must be maintained, removal of economic barriers among nations, reduction of armaments and armament burdens, a mandate system to allow for an adjustment on colonial claims, notably in the interest of areas where there were native people and those native people's colonizers. Self-determination, which almost seems like a contradiction. Independence, oppressed minority groups choose their government. So in this situation, like, the mandate system continued for Egypt, right? They remained a colony. The mandate system continued for the Philippines. They remained a colony or a territory. But self-determination worked out for Poland. It worked out for Czechoslovakia. They became new nations. So these two created a pretty significant amount of debate. And then, of course, Wilson's baby, the League of Nations, a peacekeeping organization to be formed to prevent future global wars. So they call this the Great War, the war to end all wars, but there's a problem here. The United States does not, A, sign and approve the Treaty of Versailles, nor do we join the League of Nations. This is a really great cartoon I want everybody to take note of. It's got the League of Nations bridge, Belgium, France, England, Italy. The United States is the keystone. Here's Uncle Sam kicked back, smoking a cigar, resting on the keystone. Let's talk a little bit about George Creel and American propaganda. George Creel and the Creel Committee created the American propaganda, and I'll be darned if they didn't leave a lasting legacy, right? We still have propaganda that impacts us regularly. So if you think about how military propaganda impacts you, give me an example of military propaganda that you've witnessed over the last month. Uncle Sam, in your face, right? I want you. George Creel and the Creel Committee, they create Uncle Sam as we know him. We know that Uncle Sam dates back to what war, though? Before that, 1812, very good. The War of 1812. But the way that Uncle Sam looks, the iconic image of Uncle Sam is developed by George Creel, right? So the Creel Committee is not just about, George Creel is not just about propaganda posters. It's about radio spots. It's about developing movies like The Kaiser and The Beast of Berlin. Patriotic songs. Has anybody ever heard Over There, Say a Prayer? Nobody? Yeah. We'll check it out a little bit later. Oh yeah? Nice. So, in the 5th grade? That's awesome. All right, so we have George Creel on the top left. There's Uncle Sam on the bottom left. And then this is a really famous anti-German Beast of Berlin. Destroy this mad brute. He's got the mustache like Kaiser Wilhelm. The German helmet, militarism, culture on the club, bloodied club. Enlist, U.S. Army. Do keep in mind that a set of acts that are very unpopular passed the sedition, the Espionage and Sedition Acts. You've heard about something like this before, all the way back to John Adams' presidency, the passage of the Alien and Sedition Acts. This round of them, Espionage and Sedition, basically were developed out of fear of spy networks, because there had been a German spy network that had been discovered in New York City. The Sedition Act said that people couldn't criticize the government. This leads to the leader of the Socialist Party, Eugene V. Debs, and William D. Haywood to be arrested, convicted, and sent to prison under the Sedition Act. This is where Debs runs for president as a socialist candidate from jail. The last time he ran. And I've got Debs' breakdown. Those are all the elections he ran in for president. 1900, 1904, 1908, 1912, and 1920 as a socialist candidate. So here we have Eugene V. Debs, bottom left. This is his campaign button for president, convict number 9653. And there's William Haywood up top on the right. America's going to mobilize for war under Wilson. We have a selective service that's going to be passed. We've got a Council on National Defense to study the mobilization. America is obviously going to grow much larger following this war than only the 15th largest standing army in the world at the start of this war. Really, the mobilization had to be a partnership between government, labor, and industry. So labor unions couldn't be ignored, big business couldn't be ignored. The government also increases the level of income tax passed, and some people got taxed as much as the tax bracket moved as much to like 60–70%. This was wildly unpopular. National War Labor Board was established, headed up by William Howard Taft, Frank P. Walsh, and this allowed for unemployed men to be drafted into the Army. American Federation of Labor supports the war because obviously there's plenty of work. Not all labor unions supported the war. One labor union in particular that was against it was the IWW, the Wobblies. War bonds were sold. Boy Scouts of America selling war bonds. A number of different folks selling war bonds. So where we're going to focus, most U.S. soldiers wound up on the Western Front. However, there's fighting on the Western Front, Eastern Front, North Africa, Mediterranean, Atlantic, the Caucasus. There's fighting all over. So, preparing the doughboys for war. Leonard Wood. Does anybody remember learning about Leonard Wood? He's the guy that served with the Rough Riders. He's going to help form the National Security League, the push for the draft. General Hugh Johnson drafted the Selective Service Act to allow for folks to be drafted. Most people in this situation, a lot of guys volunteered once America went to war. Some people were drafted. African Americans were allowed to fight in combat, but they fought in segregated units. Training was rushed throughout. A lot of training occurs in Virginia, places like Fort Lee, Fort Story, even makeshift forts throughout Virginia are going to be established to prepare soldiers to head off to war in World War I. So we've got some different images here. On the top left, African American soldiers that served in the war. received a lot of respect in France upon victory in the war. And a lot of African Americans that served stayed in France because there was something that wasn't in France, and that was Jim Crow. They had more freedom and more respect for their service in France than many of them did in the United States. On the bottom left here, we've got U.S. Marines who have been injured standing with a U.S. Nurse that would have served with the American Red Cross. And then this is what the normal American doughboy looked like. He doesn't get the name doughboy because he's dressed in this gingerbread-looking uniform. That's not it at all. It actually gets the name because these guys used a doughy type substance to clean off their belts, their spats, and their uniforms. And that's how they got the name doughboys. So that is what your American doughboy looked like. Obviously, a lot of new technology in the war. Remember, we come about an end of the American Civil War. We talked about that being a war of modern warfare. It starts with a rifled musket and ends with a machine gun. It starts with Napoleonic tactics and ends with trench warfare. Well, this war begins with trench warfare. You have barbed wire separating much of the area between the trenches known as no man's land. Airplanes are going to advance. Aeronautical fighting is going to advance rapidly. The Newports, the Sopwith Camel, the Fokker, those are going to be, start this war with like people firing guns out of cockpits to mounted guns in cockpits to bomb doors installed in cockpits. This is revolutionary. Poison gas, highly controversial, mustard gas and chlorine gas. Tanks, the Brits are the pioneers of the World War I tank with the British Little Willie and the Mark I, aka the mother tank of World War I. And everybody else starts to catch up. The Russians, the Germans, the Americans. Anybody know who our father of American tank warfare is? Production, yes. But Sherman is a good guess because of the Sherman tank. Think of the guy commanding Sherman tanks there. You're on the right track. Not Pershing, but Patton. George Patton. He's the guy that's going to start mounting guns to Jeeps, or not Jeeps, but trucks, and later mounting guns to Jeeps, and later developing the American style of tank warfare. He serves in this war, right? So we've got tanks, machine guns, hand grenades, flamethrowers, advanced rifles, like the 1903 Springfield, 1892, 99 Springfield, 1917 Enfield. So this is American, British. Submarines, German U-boats, British Q-boats, Zeppelins and balloons used during the war as well. And then anti-aircraft howitzers. This is a really awesome picture. Kind of gives you an idea of what we're looking at. Because we've got soldiers milling around. We've got British tank, anti-aircraft, and wagons being pulled by horses. A lot happening in this picture for World War I. So let's take a look at fighting on the Western Front. Remember, the Bolsheviks seized control of Russia. So as they withdraw the nation from the war, they free up thousands of German troops to fight on the Western Front. America comes in and sort of in the mopping up effort of this war. The majority of Americans are going to fight on the Western Front. There are some U.S. soldiers that will fight in Russia at Archangel, but the overwhelming majority, there are some groups in North Africa, very small detachments in North Africa, very small detachments on the Eastern Front. Most of your U.S. soldiers are serving on the Western Front. 10,000 troops, U.S. soldiers are sent to Siberia as part of the Allied expedition. Purpose was to prevent munitions from falling into the hands of the Central Powers, aid Japanese forces, rescue some 45,000 trapped Czechoslovakian troops, and prevent Bolshevik forces from snatching up military supplies. And then, of course, the Russian Bolsheviks resented this interference, and this has a lasting impact in the post-war era. So what we're looking at mainly is the American involvement here on the Western Front along the lines of Belgium, Germany, Luxembourg, and France. Yes. Man, that's a really good question, and I would say I don't know what that number is, but I would have to. We can look that up. I would say I feel like whether it was like voluntary or it was probably more of a voluntary scenario, but I think it would be kind of crazy to say no. Does that make sense? Yeah. So we can take a look at that. All right. So I'm going to hand, as I move on, I'm going to hand a few things around. This is Red Cross training. Take a look at this for medics. See the devastation of the Western Front. This is a bombed out cathedral on the Western Front in France. Allied soldiers dug into trenches on the Western Front here. The American Lost Battalion here. The 77th Infantry Division. And this is just showing you how far the war spread. These are Allied soldiers marching into Jerusalem. All right. So, similar to the image that I was just passing around, Allied soldiers in the trenches. So in the spring of 1918, the French prevented the Germans from invading Paris. This is the first Battle of the Marne. American reinforcements arrived to help the French Field Marshal Foch defeat the Germans in the strategic offensive. The Second Battle of the Marne, Allied forces forced Germany to withdraw, and the Germans never effectively reversed this defeat. This is truly a turning point in the war, and one of the most significant turning points America was involved in. America was led by General John J. Blackjack Pershing, West Point class of 1886, same guy that led the American forces in Mexico, and his group was known as the AEF, American Expeditionary Force. Colonel George C. Marshall, VMI class of 1901, graduate of my alma mater. He was a military aide to Camp and close advisor to Pershing, key planner of American operations, was instrumental in the design and coordination of American forces on the Western Front. Another guy I wanted to talk about too is Eddie Rickenbacker. He's the American equivalent to the Red Baron during World War I. He is our flying ace, Eddie Rickenbacker. Here we have General Pershing on the left, George C. Marshall there on the right. Marshall ends up becoming the Army Chief of Staff and Franklin D. Roosevelt's key military advisor during World War II. So the United States also has another really big hero from this war, Alvin York. He was a conscientious objector that refused to fight. He decided to go on and fight the war, and he will single-handedly kill 20 Germans and capture 132 more. He becomes sensationalized and part of the Creole propaganda machine as well. By the fall of 1918, Germany was outmanned, outgunned, and ready to surrender. The British blockade in the Atlantic was also starving the German soldiers. The Lost Battalion, 9 companies of the 77th U.S. Division, I sent a picture around of them. About 554 men were isolated by German forces behind enemy lines in World War I after an American attack in the Argonne in October of 1918. And then at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, it's the reason we celebrate Veterans Day on November 11th, Germany laid down their arms, were forced to sign an armistice, and all was quiet on the Western Front. Armistice Day is still celebrated on November 11th. Here we have Alvin York on the left, and this is the Argonne Forest over here on the right. Not far from the Argonne is where the French will have the Germans sign the surrender or the armistice in a train car. Do keep in mind that when Germany invades France in the spring of 1940, France has to surrender to Germany on June 22nd. Hitler will force France to sign their surrender in the exact same train car. So we'll talk more about that when we move into World War II. I think I got all those primary docs passed around. So now we're looking at hammering out the treaty. The big four, Orlando, Clemenceau, David Lloyd George, and Woodrow Wilson are the ones brokering the Versailles Treaty. Wilson's the first president to go abroad to broker a foreign treaty. Obviously, Wilson wants the League of Nations and his 14 points to be followed through with, but the British and the French want Germany to pay retribution. They want them to get total blame for the war. And ultimately, it leads to a war guilt clause that leads to $33 billion in reparations to be paid, total blame for the war, total disarmament, and Germany's going to lose a lot of land. Like the Rhine Valley's turned into a demilitarized zone. They lose Alsace-Lorraine region with really lucrative coal fields. They lose the Sudetenland of Western Czechoslovakia. They lose parts of Prussia. Poland is going to receive self-determination. This is all going to lead to the causes of World War II. I love this political cartoon. The hand are all of the leading countries in the Versailles Conference or the Versailles Treaty, and these are all the big four shoving the peace terms down Germany's throat. This is the Hall of Mirrors. If you ever have the opportunity to visit Paris, take half your day and go out visit Versailles. It's 14 miles outside of Paris. Beautiful palace. Sorry, but 5 years to the day of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the Versailles Treaty will be signed. So in the end, the United States is reluctant to sign The U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee is led by Republicans, notably Henry Cabot Lodge, who's not interested in this because this might pull America into more entangled alliances and into European affairs. Wilson is going to return to the United States with the treaty, with the plan for the League of Nations, because they will, in fact, move forward with the League of Nations. And he goes on this whistle-stop tour around the country trying to advocate for the treaty. Just so happens he gets sick in Pueblo, Colorado, returns back to D.C., suffers a paralytic stroke. This was really detrimental. In fact, his wife, Edith Wilson, she could be considered the first female president because as First Lady, she pretty much ran the day-to-day operations in the White House as if everything was fine. Ultimately, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee rejects the treaty and refuses for the United States to join the League of Nations. Some of those opposed to the treaty and the League: Henry Cabot Lodge, William Borah, and Hiram Johnson of California. Here on the left, Woodrow Wilson. On the right, Henry Cabot Lodge. So Lodge and his crew are moving America toward an era of what? Where we close our doors. Nice job. They're moving us in a direction toward isolationism. Well done. So in the end, there's objection to the foreign policy decision. It's made by the international organization. America's reluctant to approve the treaty. Certainly, not all U.S. leaders agree. The U.S. Senate did not approve the Treaty of Versailles. U.S. Congress and Woodrow Wilson had problems with bipartisanship. They couldn't see eye to eye on this. A couple of great cartoons related to it. See that horrible vulture? Take it away, take it away. Senator fearful of that dove with an olive branch. And then here we have Henry Cabot Lodge escorting the battered Treaty of Versailles out of the operating room, Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. It says the lamb from the slaughter. So in a nutshell, Versailles led to France and England insisting on the punitive measures against Germany, forcing them to pay reparations, disarmament, loss of land, total blame for the war. League of Nations is created, but the United States doesn't join. National boundaries are redrawn, creating many new nations. That leads to resentment, notably Poland, Czechoslovakia. Those are going to be some areas of resentment. Most of the 14 points were abandoned, which made Germany feel betrayed by the U.S. Wilson left Paris unhappy with a finalized treaty. Problems continued for the boundaries, economies, governments, and societies of Western and Central Europe, and this is all going to come to a head in the Second World War. So what is the legacy of World War I and the Treaty of Versailles? Well, American entry into World War I ensured Allied victory. It was a bit of a mopping up of that war, but it failed to conclude a lasting legacy of peace. Eventually, it sets the world, not just America, on a collision course toward the economic depression known as the Great Depression, which was not just American but global, and it also leads to the events that will start and cause World War II. So I'll leave you with some more Creel Committee propaganda. Beat back the Hun with Liberty bonds. Be patriotic. Sign your country's pledge to save food, food rationing, and then defeat the Kaiser and his U-boats. Victory depends on which fails first. Food or frightfulness, eat less wheat. So these are all Creel Committee pieces of propaganda. Any questions out there? All right.